At this point, we're going to talk about the pharmaceutical industry. We're going to talk a little bit about the largest players and then how they best position their products for their own personal gain. So, worldwide, we consume a lot of psychotropic pharmaceuticals. The United States typically consumes the most, but other countries consume a lot as well. This includes essentially developed countries like France, Japan, and even some of the lower income countries like Argentina, South Africa, and Pakistan. The use of psychotropic pharmaceuticals is a worldwide phenomenon. The thing that's not in this table and the thing that is unique to the United States is the use of opioids. So, opioids and the opioid epidemic is almost entirely a United States phenomenon. There are enough prescriptions for opioids for one prescription for every adult in the country. There's just a massive amount of drugs, and this is actually what separates the US from other countries in terms of their pharmaceutical use. So who's producing all of these drugs that the world uses, and who's producing all of the opioids that primarily the United States uses? Well, here are the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world by revenue. Now, in a previous video, I talked about the largest alcohol manufacturers in the world, the largest alcohol producer, as AB InBev. And they have an estimated yearly revenue of about $55 billion. To give you the scale of the pharmaceutical industry, there are 4 pharmaceutical companies in 2013 who are near or above that number. So you have Johnson & Johnson, who had $71 billion in revenue, Novartis at 59, Pfizer at 52, and Hoffman at 50. And that's just the top 4. The rest of the top 10 are all nearly $20 billion in sales or above. There is a lot of money in pharmaceutical sales. And they spend a lot of money to get there. Now, they get a really large profit margin. They're making a lot of money off of these products. And one of the reasons they're doing it is because they spend so much money selling us these products. So if you look at Johnson & Johnson, the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, estimated revenues at $71 billion, they spent $17.5 billion marketing their products in 2013 alone. 2013 alone. There are 2 other companies, Novartis and Pfizer, who spent over $10 billion, actually spent over $11 billion in marketing alone, just for their products. Not on research and development, not making their products safer, not developing new products, but marketing their products. And actually, in almost all of these cases, and I think in all of these cases in this table, more money is being spent on selling the products and marketing the products than at research and development, which is striking. The origin of the pharmaceutical industry started off not necessarily in the best of conditions. It started really with the whole idea of patent medications in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And these patent medications were secret preparations done in some centralized facility outside of essentially the pharmacy and had very specific ingredients. So the recipe was the same no matter which bottle you bought. Now, most of these didn't actually do anything. They were essentially quacks. They were shams. If they did anything at all, it was the placebo effect. But this idea, the idea that you can patent a recipe, you can make it in a centralized facility, and then you could sell the same recipe to everybody, was really the forerunner, was really the beginnings of the modern pharmaceutical industry, because that's exactly what they do. And what these patents did is give the company a monopoly over one specific recipe. So even if your product didn't work, you were the only company who would even be able to sell your product if you were able to patent it. Now, patents aren't forever. They last something like 10 or 20 years, depending on the country. But when you have that monopoly, those products are highly profitable. And what companies will do is they'll try to extend their patent by finding new ways to use the same recipe. So if there's a new indication for a new drug, then they can extend the patent because it's a new application. They only really expire when the applications of the product essentially run out. For patent medicines and for prescription drugs, there's essentially a consistent pattern that always occurs. So when a new drug finally gets approved here in the US, that's by the Food and Drug Administration, there's this massive enthusiasm for the new drug. This is usually accompanied by a hard marketing push, a heavy advertising push to make people aware of it, to make physicians aware of it, to try to get as many new prescriptions of the drug as possible. Once that happens, once that wears away, physicians tend to overextend the usefulness of the drug into areas where it may not have been intended to be used. So they'll prescribe one drug which was tested for one condition for a separate condition, which is essentially untested. There's actually no indications, at least through randomized clinical trials, that it will do anything. Maybe it's on anecdotal evidence or spotty observational evidence. Once that's done, the next step that typically occurs for a typical pharmaceutical is that more experience with the drug in the idea that it's a perfectly effective drug kind of wears away. So rather than thinking this is a wonder drug, it's going to solve not only the problem it's indicated for, but other problems as well, people start realizing that it doesn't really have it. It's not as effective as the clinical trials indicated. The efficacy of the drug is not the same as the effectiveness of the drug, and the effectiveness is always lower. There's typically also a moment in time where we realize there's more adverse side effects of the drug than we were anticipating. And this is because some very serious adverse events only occur in very rare occasions. So a clinical trial of a few thousand people isn't going to pick up something that only occurs in 1 in maybe 50 or 100,000 people, even though that side effect could be really dangerous. It could be severe illness, it can even be death. And then finally, this wave of enthusiasm is over. We don't really expect to be as effective as initially thought. There's more side effects than we initially thought. So now it kind of falls into that standard pattern of use. We keep using the drug, but for a limited number of conditions and in narrow circumstances. It's no longer a wonder drug. So for a typical psychopharmaceutical, when it first enters the marketplace, it's that wonder drug. It's going to cure all diseases, but over time it gets extended too much, it gets overused. We learn more about it because of that overuse. I guess that's a small beneficial side effect. And then once we realize it's not all it lived up to be, we kind of use it in those original very narrow circumstances. Now marketing. I mentioned marketing for these products. So, and how much there is. So in 2014, these psychopharmaceuticals were marketed using $71 billion worldwide. So there were $71 billion worldwide spent marketing prescription drugs. And there's two targets. The primary target are the prescribers, but in 2 countries, these companies can actually directly target the patient as well. So the prescribers. Pharmaceutical companies will use sales representatives to go out and physically meet with prescribers, whether they're physicians, they can be nurses, they can be physician assistants, however the regulations of the company, like in a country, allow different people to prescribe drugs. Free samples of the drugs are given out so that they can be given out to patients free of charge. So the idea is that if a patient takes it, says they like the effects of it, maybe they don't see the side effects right away, if there are any at all, the physician, the prescriber, is more likely to actually give a prescription outside of these free samples. It's not as egregious as it used to be, but there's still a practice of gifting where pharmaceutical companies will pay for food, will pay for swag, so pens, other labeled products, branded products for the prescribers. They've actually developed apps for these prescribers and other social media platforms. But the point of all of this is that all of these marketing practices work. So if we go back to the gifting, for example, let's just go there. There's 2 ways that it's currently working and operating to its most effectiveness here in the United States. One is the idea of continuing education. So a pharmaceutical company will sponsor a continuing ed program. And during that time, it'll be known that they're sponsoring it, but they'll also give free food. So they may not be directly paying for someone's meal. It's not steak out and, dinner out at the steakhouse, but they're giving people free lunches for them showing up to these different seminars. And then finally, if you look at the last word in that bullet point, pens, it turns out that just getting a single pen from a pharmaceutical company a single pen will impact your practices. People, physicians and nurses and everyone else who can prescribe these drugs will actually prescribe certain brands more often and certain companies more often just because they were given a pen. So these practices work. The idea of giving free samples of the pharmaceuticals outside of the whole prescription practices, the idea of kind of a very old-fashioned thing of sales representatives actually going and talking to physicians, they all work. And they work to a great, great extent, as you can see from how much money the industry is making. Now, there are 2 countries where pharmaceutical companies can directly market to the consumers. That's the United States and New Zealand. These are the only developed countries that allow what's known as direct-to-consumer advertising. And there's 3 types of advertising that occur. One is help-seeking. In these ads, it's essentially, what they do is they discuss a list of symptoms. And then they say, if you have these lists of symptoms, something might be wrong. You may have this disease and you should talk to your doctor. They don't actually mention the drugs themselves, but they mention the disease the drug is potentially going to treat. There are reminder ads. Reminder ads might mention the product, but they don't actually say what the product will do or what the product will treat. They just remind you that this disease is a real thing and remind you to talk to your doctor about this one product. It's kind of a weird category. And then you have product claim ads. These are the ads that say this drug X does action Y to get Z results. So these are the ads with all of those warnings that come on top of it, where they talk really fast and only want to show you the good things. The purpose behind these ads is really to increase demand. It's not necessarily a market share thing as it would be with, say, tobacco or alcohol, because they're not competing with each other anymore. Remember, these are patented products. When a pharmaceutical company has a patent, another company can't sell the same thing. And when they can't sell the same thing with something as in this category, you can't treat the same disease, at least in the same way. So you're really trying to drum up demand for their product, particularly when there is no demand, when it's not needed. So now I'm getting on my cynical soapbox at the moment, but you're essentially creating diseases on some level, or creating the conditions for people to think they have something that needs to be treated more often and treated with a very specific product. And of course, that's the product that's being marketed in the ad you're seeing.